Have you ever noticed how it's so hard to even talk about wealth and poverty? It's like we're all kind of reading from different scripts, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? How we cling to these narratives, these stories we tell ourselves to try to make sense of it all. A really complex issue for sure. And a lot of times, those stories end up revealing more about our own biases than the actual reality of poverty.
Exactly. So that's what we're going to dive into today, the stories, especially the ones rich people often tell themselves about, why poverty exists. We've got a whole stack of research analysis, historical context, the whole shebang to help us unpack these wealth narratives.
And I think you might be surprised to learn just how deep these narratives go. It's not just personal beliefs, but they're baked into our systems and institutions too.
Okay, so let's start with a big one right off the bat, the myth of the meritocracy. The whole idea that success is just all about hard work and talent, and if you're struggling, it's, well, you're just not trying hard enough. We've all heard that one, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. This myth is everywhere. It's in how we design our education system. It's how we portray success in the media. It's like that classic pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing.
But what about those who don't even have boots to begin with? Our sources point to well, pretty harsh reality, I guess you could say, that a child's zip code is actually a much stronger predictor of their, future economic success than all their individual effort.
That's such a good example because it really drives home how much those systemic factors, the environment you're born into, often kind of outweigh individual effort. It's not that hard work doesn't matter at all, right? But it really makes you think about how that myth of the meritocracy really ignores all those barriers that prevent upward mobility, especially for those born into, disadvantaged communities.
Yeah, it's like we're all playing this game, but some people are starting off with a massive head start, right?
Right.
They got all the best equipment, a rule book that totally benefits them.
Yeah.
While others are stuck playing uphill with no resources.
Exactly. And then on top of that, we tell them to just try harder. And this all kind of feeds into another one of those pervasive narratives, the whole personal responsibility frame, which, as you can imagine, really emphasizes individual choice and, accountability while kind of downplaying all those systemic barriers that we were just talking about.
Right. We see this all the time.
Yeah.
Right. Blaming single mothers for not, say, pursuing higher education while completely ignoring the lack of affordable childcare or, criticizing those who are struggling to just make ends meet because they're not budgeting better without taking into account stagnant wages and the fact that everything costs twice as much as it used to.
It's tough, and our sources highlight how this whole narrative really took off back in the 1980s with all those neoliberal policies that came in, which, really pushed this idea of individual responsibility while at the same time cutting back on things like social safety nets. So it's almost like telling someone, hey, swim across this river, and then dismantling the bridge and taking away all the life vests.
Brutal. And then, of course, there's the ever so popular welfare dependency stereotype. That image of, lazy people just leeching off the system, happy with handouts and totally unwilling to work.
Yeah, that one's a real classic. This stereotype gets, it's really fueled by the media and political rhetoric, and it's super harmful and honestly just statistically inaccurate. Because the truth is, the majority of those who rely on public assistance are actually working. And long-term welfare dependency, it's actually super rare.
What's kind of crazy is how this specific narrative often carries these racial undertones, especially here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Where the whole welfare queen thing has been for a long time associated with, well, Black women. It's like poverty gets mixed up with this whole other layer of racial prejudice, which, just perpetuates those harmful biases even more.
Absolutely. And it lets people kind of distance themselves from those who are experiencing poverty to think of it as a personal failure, instead of a systemic issue that we actually need to be addressing.
It's a way to, I guess, to kind of wash your hands of it.
Yeah, exactly.
So this brings us to another layer of these wealth narratives, the cultural deficit story.
Right. And that's the one where you blame poverty on the, supposed cultural flaws of an entire community, claiming that they lack the values or the work ethic or even the intelligence to succeed.
Oh, yeah. You hear it all the time. Stuff like those people just don't value education or, they have a culture of poverty.
Exactly. It's a super dangerous way of othering that ignores all this historical and economic baggage while blaming the, victims of poverty for their own circumstances.
Oh, wow. It's like blaming a plant for not growing when it's been planted in terrible soil and never gets any sunlight.
That's a great way to put it.
And our sources actually highlight this really well with the example of rural poverty, because a lot of rural communities get hit with that backwards label, or people say they're resistant to progress. But what that ignores is the decades of like economic neglect that they've experienced. Factory closures, lack of infrastructure, really limited access to things like education and healthcare.
Right. So instead of actually addressing the root causes of poverty, we blame the communities that are just trying to survive in the middle of all these challenges, which, again, just lets us off the hook and kind of justifies doing nothing. So we've talked about 4 pretty big narratives, right? Meritocracy, personal responsibility, welfare dependency, and that whole cultural deficit model. But, before we jump into the 5th one, I think it's worth asking, why do these stories even stick around? What makes them so hard to change, even when we've got all this evidence that, kind of contradicts them?
It's like they take on a life of their own, don't they? They get passed down, people keep repeating them, and they almost become like part of our culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And one way to explain that is through, it's a psychological concept called the just world hypothesis. Basically, it's our deep need to believe that the world is fundamentally fair, that people get what they deserve, good or bad.
So if someone's rich, then they must have earned it through hard work and, making good choices. And if someone's poor, well, it must be because they did something to deserve it. It's like a way to make sense of things, right? To feel like there's some kind of order in a world that can feel pretty chaotic.
Exactly. And that need to believe in a just world can really blind us to all the systemic stuff that's actually contributing to inequality. And our sources actually point out how this bias gets even stronger through, socialization, especially in those circles where these narratives tend to, come from in the first place.
You mean like those exclusive networks, private schools, all those elite institutions where wealth and power tend to be?
Exactly. Those environments can become these echo chambers where these narratives just keep getting repeated over and over again, right? And pretty soon they start to sound like common sense, even when they completely clash with people's actual experiences and all the data we have.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle, isn't it? The wealthy create and, maintain systems that benefit them, then use these stories to justify it all, justify the system and their place in it.
And then there's the media, which often just makes things worse, right?
Yeah.
They're amplifying these narratives, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not. News stories, they might focus on these individual stories of poverty, but they miss the whole bigger picture of the systemic stuff. And entertainment. Well, entertainment loves to reinforce all those stereotypes, portraying people experiencing poverty as either, completely helpless victims or lazy freeloaders.
We were bombarded with these narratives constantly from every direction. No wonder they're so hard to, to break down. It's like trying to pull up a tree whose roots have grown under the whole forest.
Right. And on top of that, we got to remember those economic incentives that keep these narratives alive and well, because the wealthy, they benefit from a system that concentrates wealth and power in their hands. So it's in their interest to keep telling stories that, make that system seem okay and to fight back against any calls for change.
So it's not just about unconscious bias, right?
Yeah.
There's actually a real effort to protect those power structures.
Me.
Which kind of brings us to this concept called cultural hegemony, which one of our sources goes into.
Right. So cultural hegemony is basically how the dominant group in society, shapes the main narratives and values that everybody starts to accept, even the people who are actually disadvantaged by them.
So all these stories about wealth and poverty, they become so normal, so everyday, that they just start to feel like common sense, even when they're actually serving the interests of, just a tiny handful of people. It's like one of those magic tricks, right?
Yeah.
We're so focused on the individual's choices and actions that we completely miss the giant systems at play.
Yeah, it's a super effective way to keep things the way they are without seeming like you're, forcing anyone into anything. And this makes it even harder to fight those narratives because you're not just up against individual beliefs, you're up against this whole system of power and control.
Which can feel pretty overwhelming, right? It's like David versus Goliath or something. So how do we even start to dismantle these narratives? Are we just stuck with them forever?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, they might be really deeply rooted, but they're not unchangeable. The first step is just recognizing them for what they are, right? Tools that are being used to justify inequality, not, accurate reflections of how things actually are.
So awareness is key. Being able to spot these narratives when you hear them and really understanding the biases and, the systems that they're based on. Okay, but what's next? How do we go from just being aware to actually doing something?
That's where things get interesting. And that's where we need to start bringing in the data, the evidence. We have to, arm ourselves with facts and figures that actually challenge all those simplistic narratives we've been talking about. Remember that statistic about a kid's zip code being a better predictor of their success than all their effort? That's a perfect example. Using something like that to push back against that whole meritocracy myth.
So it's about fighting back with real evidence, right? Showing that these stories don't actually hold up when you look at, the real life experiences of poverty and inequality.
Yeah, exactly. But we also have to admit that, data by itself isn't always enough. Sometimes we have to connect with people on a deeper level, to tap into their empathy and compassion.
That's where storytelling comes in,
Yeah.
right? Sharing those real life experiences of people who are dealing with poverty, showing everyone those systemic barriers they're facing, and just humanizing the issue in a way that maybe statistics just can't do.
You got it. Stories can get past our, defenses, our rational side, and they can touch us on an emotional level. A documentary that follows a family struggling to get by, a song that captures the pain of poverty, or even a piece of art that makes you question your assumptions about who the poor are and why they're struggling. Those things can be so powerful for changing the way people see things.
It's like, I don't know, the difference between reading about a hurricane in a textbook versus actually living through one. One gives you the facts, the other, totally changes you.
Exactly. And it's that change, that shift in perspective that can lead to real change, the kind that lasts.
Okay, so we've got data to go up against the myths and stories to connect with people's hearts. But what about that fifth narrative, the one we haven't talked about yet, the one about the charitable savior?
Oh, right, that one. Well, this narrative is all about how philanthropy is, the answer to poverty. It's a story where rich people are these, benevolent heroes who generously give their time and money to help those less fortunate.
And, on the surface, that sounds pretty good, right? Who wouldn't want to help people in need?
Of course, helping others is a good thing. But the problem with this whole charitable savior narrative is that it often ends up reinforcing the power dynamics that, are actually creating the inequality in the first place.
So they're putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Right?
It might help with the immediate pain, but it's not going to fix the actual problem.
Right. Because often rich folks get to decide how their money gets used, and they tend to focus on, pet projects or, things that make them feel good instead of actually addressing the root causes of poverty. They might give money for a new homeless shelter, but then fight against any policies that would, create more affordable housing, or they donate to a food bank while opposing efforts to raise the minimum wage.
So it's about understanding that charity, while it can be helpful, it's not a substitute for actual systemic change. We need to shift our focus from those individual acts of generosity to more collective action that, tackles those underlying causes of inequality.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to your question about going from awareness to action. It starts with, with challenging these narratives, not just in our own heads, but in our conversations, in our communities, and in the whole cultural landscape.
So, wow, we really went deep on these wealth narratives and how they shape how we think about this whole complex issue. But it kind of feels like we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Yeah, you're right. This is really just the beginning. And trying to, dismantle these deeply rooted narratives, that's a long game. It's going to take a lot of effort from all of us and a lot of patience, for sure.
Yeah. It's not like we can just snap our fingers and make these stories disappear. It's more about, consciously choosing to rewrite them.
That's it. And, it's not just about changing how people think, it's about changing how they feel. We have to reach people on that, emotional level to make them really feel that injustice of poverty, not just, understand it in their heads.
And like you mentioned before, how powerful can art and music and all those creative things be in really shifting how people see things?
Oh, it's huge. A really powerful movie, a song that moves you, a piece of art that makes you think. Those things can get to you in ways that data and, logical arguments sometimes just can't. It's they let you walk in someone else's shoes, see the world how they see it, and actually feel their pain and their hopes.
So it's about using all the tools we have, right? Data, stories, art, activism, all of it, to fight back against these narratives and, try to create a world that's more just and equal for everybody.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that each of us has a part to play in this. It's not just for, politicians or rich philanthropists or artists. Everybody can do something.
So what can regular people like us do to, contribute to this change?
It starts with looking at your own beliefs. What stories about wealth and poverty are you holding on to? Where did those stories come from? And do they match up with, what you see in the world around you?
So, being honest with yourself, questioning those things you've always believed, and being willing to, I guess, unlearn some of what you've been taught.
Yep. And once you've kind of done that work on yourself, you can start to challenge those narratives in your own life, with your family, your friends, the people you work with, your community.
Having those conversations, that might be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Calling people out when they use stereotypes, sharing information that challenges those old beliefs.
Yeah, exactly. Don't underestimate the power of those, everyday interactions. They can make people start to question things, spark their curiosity and slowly start to change the story over time.
It's like that ripple effect, right? It starts small, but then it spreads. And it's about being willing to, to listen to people, to learn from them, and to just keep growing.
For sure. We all have blind spots, biases, things we need to learn more about. So going into this with humility and being willing to have those respectful conversations, even when it's hard, is so important.
It's a journey, not like a destination. A journey towards a world that's more just and fair, one conversation, one story, one action at a time.
I love that. And at the end of the day, it's a journey that's worth taking because those stories we tell, those stories about wealth and poverty, they really do shape the world we live in. So let's choose to tell stories that empower people, that inspire them, and that, create a future where everyone has the chance to thrive.
That's a great way to wrap things up. And to everyone listening out there, we hope you'll keep digging into these wealth narratives, that you'll challenge those stories you hear, and that you'll use your own voices to help create a world that's more just and compassionate. Remember, change starts with each and every one of us. So what stories will you choose to tell?